The courtroom was smaller than they had imagined, yet it felt suffocating. The polished wooden benches gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the air was thick with the scent of old law books and freshly printed documents. At the front of the room, Judge Robert Caldwell sat on his elevated bench, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the space like a king surveying his domain. Marcus and Alicia Carter stood near the defendant's table, their hands intertwined beneath the surface. They had prepared for this moment, spent countless nights studying legal precedents, drafting arguments, memorizing every clause that could support their case. But none of that could prepare them for this. The way the courtroom itself seemed to reject them before they had even spoken a word. Richard Whitmore sat across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, his crisp navy blue suit practically radiating wealth and privilege. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man with slicked-back hair and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than their car, shuffled through his neatly arranged papers. Whitmore leaned over and muttered something to him, and the lawyer smirked before nodding. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat. "Let's get this over with. Plaintiff, state your case." The lawyer stood up smoothly, buttoning his jacket before speaking in a tone laced with mock sincerity. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Whitmore, is simply trying to resolve a legal matter regarding ownership of a property that, unfortunately, the defendants are unlawfully occupying." He turned slightly, flashing a patronizing smile at Marcus and Alicia. "I understand they may not be well versed in legal intricacies, given their decision to represent themselves, but I'll do my best to explain the situation as clearly as possible." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's jaw clenched. Alicia's nails dug into the palm of her hand. Judge Caldwell barely glanced in their direction before addressing them. "Defendants, do you even have an opening statement? Or should we just move on to the part where I explain why you're going to lose?" Alicia took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor, we do have a statement." The judge exhaled loudly, checking his watch. "By all means, enlighten us." Marcus rose beside her, his voice steady but firm. "We are here because Richard Whitmore is attempting to steal our land through a legal loophole that—" Judge Caldwell raised a hand. "Steal? That's a strong word. Do you have a law degree, Mr. Carter?" Marcus hesitated. "No, Your Honor, but—" "Then let's stick to facts, not wild accusations," the judge interrupted, smirking as he turned toward Whitmore's attorney. "Counsel, you'll have to excuse their lack of legal expertise." More laughter. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, looking pleased. Alicia's blood boiled, but she kept her voice level. "The fact is, Your Honor, that my husband and I purchased this property legally, and Mr. Whitmore is trying to exploit a technicality to take it from us." The judge arched an eyebrow. "A technicality? You mean the fact that the land was improperly registered due to an outdated zoning error, making its current ownership subject to dispute?" "That's not a technicality, Mrs. Carter. That's the law." Alicia opened her mouth, but before she could respond, the judge continued. "Look, I admire your enthusiasm, I really do. But let's be honest, this isn't a movie. You two aren't some brilliant self-taught legal prodigies who are going to deliver a moving speech and win the case against all odds. You don't have a lawyer. You don't have experience. And quite frankly, you don't have a chance." The words landed like a punch. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Someone in the back coughed, as if trying to suppress laughter. Marcus exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. Alicia placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint. "Not yet." Judge Caldwell leaned back in his chair, looking amused. "I could save us all some time and just rule in favor of Mr. Whitmore now, but since I'm feeling generous, I'll let you have your little attempt at a defense. Go ahead, try to impress me." Alicia's grip on Marcus tightened. She glanced at her husband, then took a step forward, squaring her shoulders. "You've made it very clear that you don't take us seriously, Your Honor." Her voice was even, but there was steel beneath it. "So let me ask you something. Do you believe that discipline, intelligence, and strategic thinking are skills that matter in a courtroom?" The judge scoffed. "What kind of question is that?" "A relevant one." She took another step forward. "Because before you dismiss us as amateurs, there's something you should know." Marcus straightened beside her. The courtroom fell into a hush. Even Whitmore's lawyer looked slightly puzzled. Alicia's voice was unwavering. Marcus and I aren't just a couple who bought a property. We're veterans of the United States Army. We served for years in elite divisions, trained in strategic operations, intelligence analysis, and, interestingly enough, military legal procedures. A beat of silence. Then another. Judge Caldwell's smirk faltered. Whitmore's expression shifted from amusement to uncertainty. His lawyer blinked, suddenly sitting up a little straighter. Alicia took her time, letting the weight of her words settle. So no, Your Honor. We are not unprepared. We are not ignorant. And we are not going to be dismissed. For the first time since they entered the room, it was Whitmore who looked uncomfortable. MOCKS crossed his arms. Shall we continue? Judge Caldwell cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. He reached for his gavel, gripping it tightly as if it could restore his authority. Very well, he muttered, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Proceed. And just like that, the tides had begun to turn. A tense silence stretched across the courtroom. The judge shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smirk replaced by something more guarded. Whitmore no longer lounged in his seat. His fingers tapped against the table, his confident demeanor faltering. Marcus and Alicia had their attention locked on Whitmore's lawyer. He was the weak link. He might have walked in feeling superior, but now? Now, he was processing the fact that he wasn't facing just any couple. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat and spoke with forced authority. Fine. Since the defendants insist on wasting this court's time, let's continue. Mr. Whitmore's counsel, proceed with your evidence. Whitmore's lawyer, James Delacroix, according to his nameplate, adjusted his tie. His earlier confidence wasn't gone, but it had taken a hit. Still, he stood with practiced ease and gestured toward a thick stack of documents. Your Honor, the facts remain unchanged. My client lawfully acquired the rights to this land due to a zoning discrepancy that voids the Carter's claim. The original deed is invalid. He turned toward Marcus and Alicia. I understand that this may seem unfair to them, but the law doesn't operate on sentiment. Marcus leaned forward. We're not arguing sentiment. We're arguing law. Delacroix's lips twitched, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you believe the law supports your claim. Alicia didn't hesitate. She reached into her case folder and pulled out a neatly prepared set of documents. Because this zoning discrepancy you're relying on was created through an error by the city, not by us. And per Section 12, Clause B of the Georgia Property Code, an owner cannot be penalized for a clerical mistake made by a governing body, provided they purchased in good faith and have maintained legal occupancy. A low murmur rippled through the room. Whitmore's expression darkened. Judge Caldwell frowned. Where did you find that clause? Marcus met his gaze without flinching. In the same legal databases your preferred attorneys use. We studied. Delacroix gave a tight smile. That may be an interesting interpretation, but it doesn't override the city's decision to correct the zoning error, which effectively returns ownership to Mr. Whitmore. Alicia flipped to another document. Except that decision was made without a proper hearing. You see, Your Honor, the city should have notified us before making any changes that would affect our deed. They didn't, which makes their action a violation of due process. Delacroix hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But Alicia caught it. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Caldwell's fingers tapped against his desk. His jaw tightened. Marcus seized the moment. This is an illegal land grab, Your Honor, and it's being disguised as a simple zoning correction. But the law requires the city to provide affected owners the opportunity to contest a change before it's finalized. Judge Caldwell exhaled through his nose, visibly irritated. I'll need time to review these claims. Whitmore suddenly leaned in and whispered something to Delacroix. The lawyer frowned, then stood. Your Honor, I request that we dismiss these arguments as irrelevant. The city's action has already been completed. Revisiting it would be procedural overreach. Marcus gave a small, knowing nod. Whitmore was getting nervous. Alicia took a step forward. Your Honor, we have filed a formal appeal with the zoning board, which means this matter is still legally unsettled. If you grant Mr. Whitmore ownership today, you'd be making a ruling on a property that is actively under dispute. More murmurs. Delacroix's mouth pressed into a thin line. He adjusted his cuffs, but Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders. He was starting to realize this wasn't going to be a clean win. Judge Caldwell's irritation was palpable. Enough. I'll review this later. For now, let's proceed with the plaintiff's next piece of evidence. Delacroix took a breath and turned to his next argument. Your Honor, we also have a record of tax delinquency on the Carters' property, which further calls their ownership into question. Alicia didn't even blink. That's incorrect. Delacroix arched an eyebrow. Are you denying that the property taxes were overdue? Marcus opened a separate folder and slid a piece of paper toward the judge. We paid those taxes 2 months before the city's clerical error even happened. There is a record of that payment, and the city itself confirmed it. Delacroix's composure cracked for the second time. He grabbed the document and scanned it quickly. Whitmore's face twisted in frustration. Judge Caldwell pinched the bridge of his nose. Mr. Delacroix, is this true? Delacroix hesitated, a beat too long. That was all Marcus needed to see. Whitmore slammed a fist against the table. What the hell am I paying you for? He hissed at his lawyer. Judge Caldwell's glare deepened. Gentlemen, control yourselves. Delacroix cleared his throat and straightened his posture. Your Honor, the validity of the tax record doesn't change the zoning issue. Marcus smiled slightly. It does when it proves that we were legal owners at the time the error was made. Silence. Whitmore's face turned red. Delacroix kept his mouth shut. Judge Caldwell finally sighed and rubbed his temples. I need a recess. He banged his gavel. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Marcus and Alicia remained seated as Whitmore and Delacroix stood. And then they saw it, the lawyer shooting Whitmore a brief, irritated look. Alicia smirked. Did you catch that? She murmured. Marcus nodded. He's starting to see what kind of client he's dealing with. Alicia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. He's not fully on our side yet. But he will be. Marcus glanced at the door where Whitmore stormed out, furious. The cracks were starting to show. And they were just getting started. Marcus and Alicia sat in silence as the courtroom emptied for recess. They weren't celebrating, not yet. The fight wasn't over. Across the room, Delacroix gathered his papers with rigid movements, his jaw tight. Whitmore hovered behind him, voice low but sharp. What the hell was that? Whitmore hissed. You were supposed to shut them down, not let them turn this into a circus. Delacroix didn't respond immediately. His fingers curled around his pen, knuckles whitening. He was calculating. Alicia nudged Marcus. He's starting to realize he's backing the wrong side. Marcus nodded. Question is, how long until he jumped ship? The answer came faster than expected. As the recess ended and the courtroom filled again, Delacroix still hadn't spoken to Whitmore. The businessman grew more agitated, whispering harshly to his lawyer before the judge returned to his seat. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel twice. Let's finish this. I assume the plaintiff has more evidence. Delacroix stood, adjusting his tie, but something about his movements had changed. He wasn't as fluid, not as self-assured. He exhaled slowly before speaking. Your Honor, before we proceed, I have an ethical obligation to address certain issues that have come to my attention. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Whitmore's head snapped toward Delacroix. What are you doing? He whispered, eyes dark with fury. Delacroix didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he turned to the judge, voice steady but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. After reviewing the evidence, I believe there are significant misrepresentations in my client's case. Gasps. The entire courtroom tensed. Judge Caldwell's expression darkened. Mr. Delacroix, explain yourself. Delacroix hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, he pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore presented documents to support his claim, but upon closer examination, certain discrepancies suggest an intentional effort to mislead the court. Whitmore slammed his hand on the table. Are you insane? Judge Caldwell raised a hand. Quiet. His eyes were locked on Delacroix. Are you telling me your client falsified evidence? Delacroix carefully adjusted his cuffs. I'm saying the documents he submitted contain altered information that contradicts city records. Alicia exchanged a look with Marcus. This was it. The moment everything shifted. Judge Caldwell was fuming. His whole case was unraveling. "Do you have proof?" Caldwell demanded. Delacroix nodded. He pulled out the original zoning records obtained from the city, records that directly contradicted the ones Whitmore had submitted. Alicia smirked. "Checkmate." Judge Caldwell snatched the documents, flipping through them with growing frustration. Whitmore, now pale, turned to Delacroix, voice low and venomous. "You just ended your own career," he spat. "No one will ever hire you again." Delacroix finally turned to face his client, his voice deadly calm. "Mr. Whitmore, my career will survive. But yours? I wouldn't be so sure." The courtroom exploded with whispers. Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel. "Enough. This court will take this new evidence into consideration. I will not tolerate fraud in my courtroom." Alicia crossed her arms. "Interesting. You didn't seem to have a problem with fraud when you thought we were too ignorant to catch it." The judge shot her a warning glare. "Mrs. Carter, watch your tone." Alicia smiled. "I think I'll keep it exactly as it is, Your Honor." More whispers. The courtroom was turning against him. Judge Caldwell exhaled sharply. "I have no choice but to dismiss Mr. Whitmore's claim due to evidentiary misconduct." Marcus couldn't hide his grin. "You mean he lost?" Judge Caldwell's jaw clenched. "The case is dismissed." He banged his gavel harder than necessary, then turned to Whitmore. "And I suggest you retain new counsel, Mr. Whitmore." "You'll need it." Whitmore stormed out of the courtroom, his face red with humiliation. The weight of his defeat hung in the air, undeniable. Delacroix, still composed, gathered his things and gave Marcus and Alicia a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had chosen self-preservation over loyalty, and he had made the right call. As Marcus and Alicia stood to leave, a few people in the courtroom began to clap softly. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to acknowledge what had just happened. They had won, and the whole city would hear about it. The moment Marcus and Alicia stepped outside the courtroom, the shift in energy was undeniable. Before the trial, no one had taken them seriously. No. Now, they weren't just the couple who had defended themselves. They were the ones who had humiliated Richard Whitmore and exposed a corrupt system in the process. A few reporters were already gathering outside, murmuring among themselves. Alicia noticed people who had been silent earlier now watching them with quiet admiration. Marcus exhaled, stretching his shoulders. "That felt good." Alicia smirked. "Oh, we're not done yet." Just as she said it, the doors behind them burst open. Whitmore stormed out, his expression dark with barely contained rage. Delacroix followed at a slower pace, adjusting his cufflinks as if nothing in the world could bother him. Whitmore zeroed in on them. "You think you've won?" His voice was low, dangerous. "This isn't over." Alicia tilted her head. "Legally, it is." Whitmore stepped closer, voice a harsh whisper. "I don't lose. And I sure as hell don't lose to people like you." Marcus's expression hardened instantly. He squared his shoulders, stepping directly into Whitmore's space. "You just did." For a moment, there was nothing but tense silence. Whitmore's face twitched. He wanted to say something, do something, but there was nothing left for him to fight with. Delacroix, watching the exchange with an amused smirk, finally spoke. "I'd rethink your next move, Mr. Whitmore. You're already looking at potential legal trouble. Do you really want to add intimidation to the list?" Whitmore whirled around to face him, his fury shifting. "You ruined this case. You should have buried them." Delacroix didn't even flinch. "You buried yourself the moment you thought you were untouchable." Marcus and Alicia exchanged a glance. Delacroix had fully jumped ship. Whitmore's nostrils flared, but he wasn't stupid. He knew eyes were on him now. With a final furious glance at Marcus and Alicia, he turned sharply and marched toward his black town car, slamming the door behind him. The moment he was gone, Alicia sighed dramatically. "I thought he'd never leave." Delacroix chuckled. "He'll try something. Men like him always do." Marcus studied him carefully. "And what about you?" Delacroix met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Let's just say I know when it's time to switch sides." He glanced toward the reporters gathering nearby. "Enjoy your victory, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. It won't be forgotten anytime soon." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Alicia turned to Marcus. "Did we just witness a villain redemption arc?" Marcus snorted. "More like a villain survival arc." They both laughed, the tension finally beginning to ease. Then, they noticed someone approaching. It was Judge Caldwell. His expression was unreadable, but there was no humor left in his eyes. He stepped close enough that no one else could hear. "You may have won today, but you got lucky." His voice was low, almost a growl. "People like you never win in the long run." Alicia raised an eyebrow. "People like us?" Judge Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Don't get comfortable." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You know, Judge, I think you're the one who should be worried." Caldwell's face darkened. Alicia took a slow step forward. "We fought this case without a lawyer and still exposed the fraud in your courtroom. Now, imagine what we could do if we actually focused on exposing people like you." For the first time that day, Caldwell didn't have a comeback. His eyes flickered around, realizing just how many people were watching. A few reporters had noticed him, their cameras subtly shifting in his direction. His lips pressed into a thin line. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the courthouse. Alicia let out a slow breath. "He's scared." Marcus nodded. "Good." The wind picked up slightly, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus and Alicia felt light. They had fought back against the system and won. And people had noticed. As they stepped toward the sidewalk, a young black woman approached them hesitantly. She held a legal pad in her hands, her eyes bright with something close to awe. "Excuse me," she said. "I just wanted to say, what you did today. It meant something." Alicia's smile softened. "Thank you." The woman hesitated. I'm in law school. I came to watch this trial because I wanted to see how things really work in court. And, well, let's just say I learned a lot more than I expected." Marcus chuckled. "Lesson number 1, don't assume the system is fair." She nodded. "And lesson number 2, fight back anyway." Alicia grinned. "Exactly." As the young woman walked away, Marcus exhaled deeply. "We did it." Alicia nodded. "Yeah, and now we make sure it lasts." The days following the trial were a whirlwind. By the next morning, Marcus and Alicia's story had spread like wildfire. Local news stations covered the courtroom battle, highlighting how they had exposed fraud, defeated a powerful businessman, and stood up to a biased judge without a lawyer. Headlines flooded social media. Small Blue Diamond, veteran couple outsmarts corrupt businessman in courtroom showdown. Small Blue Diamond, self-represented defendants win landmark case. Judge under fire for bias. Small Blue Diamond, how Marcus and Alicia Carter embarrassed Atlanta's elite and won their land back. The public response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people across the city, some congratulating them, others sharing their own stories of injustice, saying they felt inspired to fight back. But the real impact came when Judge Caldwell's name started trending. The trial had been public, and video clips of his condescending remarks went viral. Activists dug into his record, uncovering a long history of questionable rulings, favoring wealthy white plaintiffs, dismissing discrimination cases, and handing down unfairly harsh sentences to black defendants. Within a week, the Georgia Judicial Ethics Commission announced an investigation into his conduct. Alicia smirked when she saw the news. Well. Marcus chuckled. He brought it on himself. As for Whitmore, his empire started crumbling. With Delacroix's betrayal and the fraud allegations, investors began pulling out of his businesses. The city launched a review of his real estate deals, and the IRS suddenly took interest in his finances. It was poetic justice. The man who thought he was untouchable was finally drowning in his own corruption. One afternoon, as Marcus and Alicia sat on the porch of their reclaimed land, a familiar voice called out, "You two really caused a mess." They turned. Delacroix, the former Whitmore attorney, stood at the edge of their property, hands in his pockets, watching them with that same unreadable expression. Alicia smirked. "That was the point." Delacroix exhaled. then gave a small nod. I thought you should know, Whitmore's trying to make deals behind closed doors, but it's not working. He's done. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Good. A pause. Delacroix glanced at the land around them, then back at them. What's next for you two? Alicia exchanged a look with Marcus before answering. We keep fighting. Delacroix raised an eyebrow. You're not lawyers. Marcus grinned. Neither were you when you started. That actually got a laugh out of him. Delacroix studied them for a moment longer, then gave another small nod. If you ever need a real attorney, you know where to find me. Alicia's smile was knowing. Didn't you hear? We don't need one. Delacroix chuckled, shaking his head as he walked away. As the sun set over their land, Marcus exhaled deeply. They had won. But this wasn't just about them anymore. Their victory had started something bigger, a conversation, a movement. People were paying attention now. They had proven that the system could be challenged and beaten. Alicia laced her fingers through Marcus's. This was just the beginning. Marcus squeezed her hand. Then let's make sure the next fight is even bigger. And with that, they sat back, ready for whatever came next. Because now, they knew exactly how to win.